This is actually extremely fun for me. I was a freshman at UCLA and then transferred away to Santa Cruz after about a year or so. And probably the part about Santa Cruz is me talking about having gone to Santa Cruz means you have now all created your own odd opinions of me that may or may not match exactly who I am. Or maybe it does. This is going to be cute here. Essentially, I'm hoping to treat this talk as a bit of an infomercial, talking about my just published book on this topic of opposition failure in Japan. I highly recommend this as a Christmas present. It works extremely well as a cutting board, and there are all sorts of different things you can use this for. You will be delighted with it. Yeah, there's nothing that this book cannot do for you. Now, as my title indicates, I'm going to be speaking specifically about Japanese politics, but my discussion's framed much more broadly by a concern with understanding some of the factors that can lead to a failure of party competition. This is the general idea that's driving a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. Now, as the 1990s opened, there was a lot of discussion and concern among those who study democratic societies over what were called, I put it up here, uncommon democracies. These are countries where a single party had dominated the government for multiple consecutive decades. There's a volume entitled Uncommon Democracies. This was something that people were really talking about. Now, one-party dominance should not in and of itself be something that worries us. That is, if voters genuinely prefer one party to all others, well, then we should not be concerned. But by the same token, we should expect that if this party loses popularity, well, then other parties are going to find a way to benefit. This all makes sense. And in fact, in recent years, a drop in the popularity of long-time dominant parties in countries such as Italy and Austria, and even new democracies such as Mexico and Taiwan, did in fact lead to new alternatives gaining popular support and entering the government. This all sounds fine to us. But what is genuinely extremely disturbing is when a ruling party lacks popularity yet continues to maintain its government dominance. Examples of this kind suggest a fundamental failure of the democratic process. Well, you know where I'm going to be going with this. Japan and its ruling Liberal Democratic Party represent exactly just such a case. The LDP, which has governed the country since 1955, has become genuinely very unpopular. Over the past decade, we've had economic collapse and widespread reports of political corruption, and these have led to massive voter anger in Japan. More than 50% of the public, if you ask somebody off the street, you've got a better than 50-50 shot of having the person tell you, I don't like any party whatsoever. The LDP usually receives only about 20 to 30% support ratings overall when asked. If you ask somebody what party they prefer in Japan, very few like the LDP. In addition, in general, public approval ratings for Japan's cabinet and prime ministers are strikingly low. Now, there's something of an exception with Koizumi, but even that is recently turned down as well. Frequently, cabinet approval ratings dip into the 20s, and it's not even strange to see an approval rating in single digits. If you remember Modi from not that long ago, we're talking about 8% support ratings. Most striking, and this is really one of my favorite statistics on the LDP is the most hated party in Japan. In a poll conducted not long ago, the LDP was cited by 44% of respondents as the party that they disliked the most. Now, Japanese voters are at least claimed to be quite interested in politics, so this anger with the LDP ought to be something that, well, other Japanese parties can take advantage of. But despite this huge pool of potential supporters, no credible challenger to the LDP has emerged. In this way, I mean, what we really have is a clear puzzle here, and we need to take very seriously the question about how can we see opposition party failure that's so dramatic in a democratic system where the ruling party is very unpopular. Okay, that is the general setup for the whole talk. This is the fundamental idea that's going to drive everything I'm talking about today, and I just want to give you a sense of where I'm going to be moving from this point on. I'm going to quickly in a moment give you kind of a Cliff's Notes version of a theoretical framework that I'm going to use to drive this talk. I'll explain this more. First I'll give a little hint to it, and then I'll give much more detail later on in the talk. Then I'm going to turn to some background on Japan, just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of just, how does the party system, what's it look like in Japan, and talk about some arguments that people have made about why the opposition has done so poorly and the LDP so well. But then I'm going to really focus on the critical components of the theory and also just really the main ideas here. And the first piece is the idea of candidate experience as a key to party success. And the second piece is an analysis of local opposition party failure in Japan. And finally, for those of you who are interested in Japan, there was just an election at the end of the past summer where the LDP did stunningly well. I mean, for a lot of people, shockingly well, even for it. And I'll talk a little bit about just, how such a thing occurred. Okay, so I talked about this theoretical framework. And there are two pieces to the framework. And the first involves individual candidacies. That is, in any country where you cast ballots for individual candidates, well, the key to a party's success tends to be dependent upon the strength of the given party's candidates. Now, in Japan, and I'll explain what I mean more as I go along, but in Japan, the opposition has tended to have extremely weak candidates. Now, there's an underlying problem here, though. I mean, the place where you're more likely to get decent candidates to run in national level races is subnational level. So the real question here becomes, why has the opposition done so poorly or held so few seats at the subnational level? So fundamentally, we've got to ask, why is the opposition failing so dramatically at the subnational level? And this really gets into the heart of my argument. I'm going to define these terms in a little bit, but this is just going to give you a sense of where I'm going. My central argument is that when you combine a system that's heavily clientelistic with a financially centralized government structure, what you're going to be seeing is failure in subnational office elections by parties that are not in the national government. Okay, that's just a quick version. I'm going to speak about this in much greater detail as I go along.
Can you explain about
the very short version is heavy emphasis on pork barrel, spending a lot of money on just goodies for everybody. Yeah, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so let's talk about, let's do 50 years of Japanese political history in 20 seconds. From 1955, when the LDP was born, through 1990, the LDP held a majority of the seats in every House of Representatives election, except for one minor exception, but that's actually really didn't affect things terribly much. There was a slow and steady decline in LDP support during this period, despite its relative strength. Now, in the early 1990s, anti-LDP sentiment was on the rise in Japan. People were clearly becoming more unhappy with the party. And in fact, in 1993, the party split and lost power for 11 months until partway through 1994. That said, though, the party's back in power in 1994. And since that time, the LDP has held very firmly onto power. Now, anger toward the LDP very clearly remains, and seeking to take advantage of this anger has been a new party. It's a centrist party. This is different from a lot of the opposition of the past, which a lot of people considered very radical. The new party, the Democratic Party of Japan, quite centrist and has sought to take advantage of this anger toward the LDP. Despite all that, though, LDP dominance has continued. So how have people sought to explain this dominance? Well, there are two general categories of explanation. And the first really focuses on why has the LDP been just so darn popular? And the usual explanation that people tend to come up with is it's sort of like, hey, it's the economy, stupid. Why would anybody support a party other than the LDP when the LDP was the one that, shepherded Japan through years of this unbelievable economic success? Okay, that's one argument. Another involves Japanese culture, whereby people have argued that the LDP has been really just truly phenomenal at making appeals to traditional Japanese feelings of indebtedness and obligation. Third argument suggests that, well, the LDP simply comes up with the right policy positions. It pushes policies that resonate with the average Japanese voter. Now, to some extent, these arguments hold pieces of water. I guess you can't really have a piece of water, but little small buckets of water. But there's one really big problem with these general arguments, which is the LDP is not popular. Earlier I talked about how the LDP has held a majority of the seats in every House of Representatives election 1955 to 1990. But it was doing that with less than a majority of the vote. The LDP has not won a majority of the vote since 1963. This is actually, wow. I actually always quiz my students on this. I tell them, repeatedly. And finally, there's a quiz halfway through the class. When was the last time the LDP got a majority of the vote? Well, that was what year is it now? 43 years ago. Okay, the LDP is winning a majority of seats with a submajority of the vote. So what this is suggesting for a lot of people is there's something going on in terms of the translation of votes into seats. And so people like to talk about electoral institutions. Well, the fundamental argument here is there's an electoral system used in Japan that caused coordination problems for the opposition, whereby the opposition was wasting votes. Again, to some extent, this holds water, but there are a couple of problems with focusing on this type of explanation. The first is the LDP also had some problems under this system. Coordination difficulties afflicted both sides. But something that's much more compelling, and really I think much more important, is the fact opposition failure has continued even despite the advent of a new electoral system that should have really undercut a lot of these coordination difficulties, essentially putting parties on more even ground. Now, I mentioned this new electoral system, which was instituted in 1994. Now, this system actually, the new one, actually offers us clues into the reasons for the opposition's failure. That is, the new system's a mixed member system, whereby voters are given 2 ballots. So they cast 1 ballot for a candidate in a single member district, so winner take all there. And 1 ballot for a party in proportional representation. Well, what kind of insight does this system help give us into the problems of the opposition? I think this figure here helps get at this a little bit. Okay, this figure here, in each piece here, represents the solid line, the votes being won by the LDP. And the dotted line, the votes being won by the leading opposition party in a given election. So this is just the leading opposition party. It's not the opposition as a whole. So 96, 2000, and 2003. And what you see here is top figure represents the proportion of the votes being won when voters cast their ballots for a party. Nothing to do with candidates here, just expressing some sort of preference for a party with a vote. And so what you see here is solid blue line. The LDP really is scarcely doing better than the opposition when it comes to people voting for just a party. In fact, if you look at 2003, what you see is the opposition did even better than the LDP. What happens, though, when voters are casting their ballots for individual candidates? Remember, they are casting both of these simultaneously. What you see here is a fairly substantial difference in the vote being won by the LDP and by the leading opposition party. Well, I mean, the obvious implication here is that the LDP has some sort of candidate advantage. And I spoke to, when the DPJ was trying to really figure out a number of its general strategies, I would speak to the party, to both people in charge of elections, say politicians, and also particular staff members who are running a lot of their strategery, as it were, over the candidates and all this sort of thing. And what I consistently heard when I would ask them, what's your difficulty in challenging the LDP? Well, what I would hear constantly was, we don't have any good candidates. I mean, essentially, we just end up running, I mean, the equivalent of the American My Aunt Sadie, I guess it'd be My Aunt Kimiko or something like that, who has very little experience in politics. You know, she's a very nice person, but there's no reason that we would necessarily vote for her. Now, part of the advantage, obviously, for the LDP is the fact that, you know, as a majority party or near majority party, it's got a lot of incumbents, and incumbent politicians, you know, do much better than other politicians. But there might be something else going on here as well. That is, some of the work done on U.S. congressional elections, in particular, this was the heavy emphasis was first placed on this by a political scientist named Gary Jacobson, who wrote about the importance of quality. What this really means is experience in U.S. congressional candidates' ability to do well. And what he found was quality candidates or experienced candidates were much more likely to win office. Now, the best source of quality in Jacobson's book was subnational level office. If you held subnational office, you were a quality candidate. And so at a certain point, I suggested that perhaps the LDP's advantage was in terms of its quality new candidates as well. Well, what do I mean by quality candidates? Well, I don't mean anything like quality in terms of moral fiber. I mean, these are people with substantial career experience. These are people who have name recognition. These are people frequently who have an organized base of support. I mean, these are all the things that should help them do well. Now, I've come up with an operational definition of quality here. And the operational definition is focused on candidates who are most likely to have these various qualities. Again, not the moral fiber dimension. There are a number of different backgrounds that seem to fit into a reasonable operational definition. And I note these in the second group here, involving people who'd held national level office, bureaucrats, all that sort of thing. Admittedly, though, someone could just come along and point out that I'm being somewhat arbitrary in this. Therefore, ultimately, my focus is going to be on Jacobson's definition. And I'm going to focus much more on former local office holders. Now, I'm going to talk about them in one lump group for a little bit, but I'm also going to turn to the former local office holders. By former local office holders, I mean former city mayors, prefectural assembly members, prefectural governors. I mean, these are relatively important lower-level politicians. Now, I still think using the broader definition is instructive, where I include all of these together, and I will do that for part of the time. But I'm going to turn our attention pretty quickly much more to former local office holders. I do this partly to avoid potential claims of arbitrariness on my part, but partly for reasons that'll be clearer in a few minutes when I focus on the local fortunes of the opposition in Japan. But I mean, also probably the biggest, most compelling reason for using them is the vast majority of all candidates who fit into my larger definition of quality are former local office holders. These simply make up the largest group in this general idea. Okay. This figure here represents candidacies from the 2000 House of Representatives election. I also play with this to some degree for 2003 and 2005. The general patterns look similar. I just haven't coded everything yet. Now, again, this is for the 2000 House of Representatives election. There are 300 single-member districts in Japan. And so I am looking at the candidates in these 300 single-member districts for the LDP and for the DPJ. So what kind of things can we glean from this figure? Well, top row, total candidates. Now, to some extent, the DPJ has managed to make up some ground in recent elections on this particular point, but the key point to take from this is the LDP's just got a lot more candidates. I mean, this by itself is an advantage. You can't win if you don't run somebody. Now, the second row, the new candidates row, again, we see what should be a substantial advantage for the LDP. Only 56 new candidates for the LDP. This makes sense because the LDP's got a lot of incumbents already. 139 new candidates for the DPJ. So well over half of the DPJ's candidates are new candidates. This already doesn't look very good for the opposition. Now, the percentage of new candidates who are quality. So if we look at the 139 new candidates running for the DPJ, relatively small number of them fit into the definition of quality that I came up with. These aren't people that we would expect necessarily to do well. In contrast, almost 60% of the LDP's new candidates were what I'm calling quality new candidates. Well, how are these different types of candidates doing when it actually comes to winning? Well, the percentage of non-quality new candidates who won, very low for both parties. Only about 20% for the LDP, 12% for the DPJ. In short, these non-quality new candidates aren't doing very well. Percentage of quality candidates and how they're doing. Well, what you see here is quality new candidates actually do fairly well. 42% are winning for the LDP and nearly 50% for the DPJ. Okay. Now, I also ran statistical analysis here where I controlled for a number of factors. And most important, I also disaggregated this particular figure. So I had each different type of quality candidate broken down separately. And there are a couple of key points to take from all of this. Controlling, in particular, for the quality of the candidacies, the LDP candidates were not more likely than DPJ candidates to win. In fact, in a lot of the analyses I looked at, LDP candidates, once you controlled for all these other factors, were less likely than the DPJ to win. Now, what about quality candidates and what this means? Well, quality candidates, in my analysis, were more likely than non-quality new candidates to win, once I take into account all the different controls. Former local politicians, I mean, this is the part that I'm really focusing on. Former local politicians were 15 to 30 percentage points more likely to win than non-quality new candidates. So key point here is LDP as a party is not popular. What's going on is it simply is running better candidates for these races. Okay, this analysis all indicates the problems that arise from the opposition's weak candidacies. I feel very comfortable saying that. But it doesn't explain why the opposition has had such serious recruitment problems. And so it's this problem of recruiting candidates that's going to drive the core of the talk. Naturally, I mean, the real question here becomes, why doesn't the opposition just run more candidates with local office experience? I mean, what we're seeing here is if former local office holders are much more likely to win, well, why aren't they popping up? Well, the real key here is that there are very few office holders who belong to the opposition parties at the subnational level. And this gets into my real argument here, which is combining clientelism with fiscal centralization leads to a failure in subnational office elections by parties that aren't in the national government. Now I'm actually going to talk about these things. There is a tendency, general inclination to treat party competition and the relationship between parties and voters as based on what most of us refer to as issues, right? I mean, that's typically how we're used to thinking about parties. Are they moving to the left? Are they moving to the right? Are they moving into the center? But in a lot of systems, politics are based on something quite different. And here I'm talking specifically about clientelist systems. Now, there's a very nice, extremely nuanced series of definitions within the political science literature over clientelism. We can talk about this later if you like, but essentially, I'm going to keep it simple here, focusing on the idea of clientelism as contrasting with issue-based politics and focusing on things like patronage and pork barrel. He's being really at the core of the politics. Now, financially centralized systems, there's a simpler definition to all of this. I mean, fundamentally what this is about is reliance by the subnational governments on the central government for their financing. And what's a really important point here is in financially centralized systems, as I'm talking about them, funds don't just automatically get shifted over to localities. There's actually a level of politicization here where the central government has discretion. It can make choices about where these funds go. So let's talk about what kinds of effects these can have. Well, in clientelist systems, mainstream local politicians, I mean, this is the general rule. Mainstream local politicians and clientelist systems need to show that they can bring in patronage. Okay, that's the general idea. Now, in Japan, there are some clear exceptions to this. Some parties, some politicians, some voters are clearly ideological. If that were not true, there would be no Japan Communist Party. There's also a sense of anti-clientelist movement in Japan. There is unhappiness in a lot of the country with the clientelist tendencies. But overall, the general trend clearly is on the clientelistic side. Steve Reed, one of the leading elections authorities on the Japanese case, has written that in Japan, in elections, especially local elections, each area prefers a representative who can deliver a bigger share of the benefits being distributed to one who represents them on the issues of the day. So just to give you a sense of how issues are not pervading the typical Japanese campaign, those of you who have been in Japan around election time will note the sound truck. What the sound truck is this little white minivan that cruises all around the district during election time. And essentially what you hear from the sound truck is you're not hearing about, well, let me tell you about my opinion on the latest pension reform or anything like that. What you hear over and over and over again is the candidate's name. I am Tanaka. I am Tanaka. I am Tanaka. Thank you. And to give a sense of just how truly not important issues are in all of this, there was one campaign I was following around where I was invited to ride around in the sound truck, and I got to sit in the back seat, and I got to wear my little white gloves to show that I was, pure and uncorrupt, and I was waving with my white gloves, and we're driving around the district. Again, all we're hearing is Tanaka, Tanaka, Tanaka. And all of a sudden, the person with the loudspeaker in the front turns around and hands me the microphone and says, okay, now say you're Tanaka for a while. I obviously was not being recruited to talk about, say, Japanese defense policy. What kinds of issues are being talked about? Well, typically, they're valence types of issues, things that nobody's going to have a problem with. So, for example, I, Tanaka, am for education. I, Tanaka, am against school bullying. These are utterly safe. I guarantee no one will oppose you. Big thing, though, that really comes up is construction, time and time again in these local elections, where what you get is, I, Tanaka, built you this bridge. If you re-elect me, I, Tanaka, will build you a dam. Okay, let's talk about financially centralized systems. Well, in such systems, we get another pretty key incentive, which is that local level politicians' primary function in these types of systems, well, their primary function is to help deliver benefits from the center to the locality. Now, again, there are some exceptions in Japan. In particular, some areas are more autonomous than others. They don't require the same kinds of funding from the central government. But let me just throw out some numbers to just kind of give you a sense of just how much the localities need money from the center. If you look at all taxes in Japan, so all the revenues that are being brought in through taxes, the percentage being made up by taxes being raised by the local governments is 1/3. That is, local governments are raising 1/3 of all the revenue. Local expenditures, however, make up 2/3 of all of the expenditures being made by the government at any level. So what this, I mean, in real plain English, this means local governments raise a very small amount of money, but they spend a lot. And so the rest obviously has to come from the central government. And the central government strictly controls localities' revenues and spendings. This is something, at least traditionally, it is done, and really done with something of an iron fist. So therefore, a big show is made of indicating the close ties between, say you're a local politician, you want to show that you have a close link to the national politicians, to the national politicians controlling the budget in particular. So if you walk into a local campaign headquarters in Japan, I mean, we're used to, for local campaigns in the U.S., we're used to a little bit of this, well, does the PTA, endorse this person? There's a little bit of that. But mostly what you see in these local campaign headquarters in Japan is banner after banner after banner, which indicates the name and title of a national politician, usually a national LDP politician. So what you're showing is, I, Tanaka, have this clear link to this powerful national politician that can help get us stuff. So now what happens when we combine these two features, the clientelism and the financial centralization? Well, what you've got is a system where in order to gain central funding, local level politicians have an incentive to ally with the national ruling parties. And this is reinforced all the time by national politicians who threaten to take away funding from localities that don't support them. Every election in Japan, you'll hear someone come out and say, fine, you don't have to support me, but don't be surprised if your money dries up. Now, it doesn't always use its power politically. The central government does not. In many cases, it will simply give money to areas because, well, they need the money. But what's really key is it has great discretion. And so it always has a very credible threat that it may, in fact, take away the funding of these localities. So people constantly believe that if they buck what the central government wants them to do, they will be punished. You hear people talk about this all the time. To the point that local politicians have clearly internalized this general idea. There was, in 1996, this was a period where there was some uncertainty. The LDP had been out of power for a little period. An opposition party was looking like it was relatively strong relative to the LDP. And a local politician in one prefecture was asked, well, who are you going to support? And this is somebody who had had long ties to the LDP. And his response was, it does not matter whether the LDP or another party wins the election. What matters to us is to stand in line with the ruling party, whichever the case is. Well, this has a very important effect. Ultimately, the LDP is truly dominating local politics, is this a fact? Now, if you look at these figures here, these figures represent the proportion of seats being won by parties. I know that the years are unbelievably tiny here. This is 1970 to 1997. And the solid line in each of the figures represents the proportion of seats being won in the National House of Representatives for a given block, so say the LDP. The dotted line represents the proportion of seats being won by the same block in prefectural assembly races. So what we see in this top figure here is just for the LDP, we see that the LDP overall tends to do extremely well. The solid line indicates that the LDP tends to do very well at the national level, and the dotted line indicates that at the subnational level, very frequently, the LDP does even better. Now, we look at what happens when you're trying to elect the opposition. And here I just combine the entire opposition. And the solid line here indicates the opposition doesn't do very well at the national level. The dotted line, though, indicates that it's doing much worse at the subnational level, consistently much worse. Now, I asked local politicians, I asked people in charge of local campaign headquarters for the opposition, why is the opposition doing so poorly relative to the LDP at the local level? And in particular, why has the LDP dominated the subnational level to such a degree? And I got a pretty general consensus on this, but one gentleman actually put it very concisely, saying in Japanese, chuo ni tsukeru paipu. That is, local LDP hegemony is due very much to a desire to maintain what he calls a pipeline, or he said paipu. It's a very commonly used word in Japanese politics. That is, it's a pipeline between the locality and the central government. And in fact, I talked to local opposition party organizations in about half of Japan's 47 prefectures, and this was the general consensus. So how do these pipelines work? Well, essentially what you've got is, here's one part of the pipeline. It's a bunch of local LDP politicians who all have a relationship with a national patron in the LDP. And so these local politicians come to the national politician and say, hey, we need funding for a bridge, or come up, fill in the blank, whatever we need funding for. And the national politician then goes to the central government, helps to get this funding allocated, talks to the right people, and the funding gets shot on down through this pipeline to the locality. Now, ultimately, these pipelines have had an incredibly powerful impact in terms of the types of defections we've seen in Japan at the party, from or to parties. So by defections, I mean, are people leaving or going to the LDP? Politicians who say, for example, in 1993, a number of national politicians left the LDP. This is how the LDP lost power in 1993. And there's a fair number of them. At the local level, however, a much smaller percentage of politicians left the LDP to join the opposition. The only people who were leaving at the subnational level were those who had a national level patron who had left the LDP as well. Now, just to give you a sense of how important this is, though, the links to the national budget, 1994, the LDP comes back into power. Still, politicians were still willing to leave the LDP at the national level. Nobody would leave anymore at the subnational level. Absolutely nobody was taking off. Basically, it was too important to maintain the ties to the central government.
You can postpone to later if you like.
Yeah, why don't we hold it off until later, if you don't mind? Yeah, thanks. Flip side. In the late 1950s, the early 1960s, there was a big effort made by the LDP to centralize funding. Prior to that, the occupation authorities had decentralized things to a fair degree. But in the late 50s, early 60s, there was an effort made to centralize things in order to help economic growth. As this occurred, a number of prefectural governors and mayors who had been associated with the opposition joined up with the LDP because they wanted to increase their chances of gaining subsidies. Well, we can be a little bit more systematic with this. If this whole idea of, these pipelines are really important, what that suggests is something having to do with dependence on the central government. So if fiscal dependence is important to local elections, well, then we should see that the opposition is most successful where the pipeline is less important. So to put this differently, I'm just going to read off the slide here, though, the opposition's greatest success should occur in the most autonomous prefectures. Okay, well, how do we actually go about looking at this? Well, fortunately, in Japan, there is a local fiscal capability index. This is, we could call it an autonomy index. And it's based on, you take a locality's revenue, so this is local taxes, and you divide into this the locality's spending needs. Now, the locality's spending needs is actually determined entirely by a politically blind series of formulae. I mean, it's based on, how many roads you have, the number of people, all that sort of thing. Locality's revenues, what's a key point here is locality tax rates are capped pretty uniformly across the country. So you can't just mess with your autonomy index by saying, hey, we'll raise taxes, and that will adjust the autonomy index. Ultimately, you're fairly stuck on this. So this is actually a fairly apolitical way of measuring things. So what kind of impact has this had? Well, this figure here looks at essentially the correlation between this level of dependence on the central government and the success by the opposition. So the horizontal axis here represents the autonomy index. The vertical axis represents the success by the opposition. So each of these dots represents the opposition as a whole in a given election. And so I looked at 7 elections from 1967 to 1991. So each dot is how well did the opposition do in a given prefecture in a given election. And what you see here is as autonomy goes up, as prefectures rely less on the central government, the opposition is doing better. In short, the opposition tends to do well in local elections only where this pipeline function is less important. And I ran a series of statistical analyses where I controlled for a number of other factors, and this relationship held still. Now, it's hard to imagine these local central pipelines being important in non-clientelistic, non-centralized cases. So ultimately, I mean, the results really here are important for supporting the general argument about the combination of these two features. Really important piece to all of this as well, as far as getting some sort of idea here, is actually some sort of comparative examination. That is, a lot of you may buy the argument up to this point about what I've been saying about the Japanese case, but does this work more broadly? And perhaps we can learn a little bit from looking more broadly. Most of what I've been talking about is from one chapter of my book. This table here represents a snapshot of an entirely different chapter where I look at all the countries listed here. And the two main factors I've been discussing, as I mentioned, is sort of what we could call voter-politician linkage and fiscal centralization. So we could talk about this as sort of in dichotomous terms, where on one side a country can be clientelistic or it can be more what we can call issue-oriented or programmatic. A country can also be fiscally centralized or decentralized. Now, I could say a lot about these different cases, but ultimately what's most striking here is the fact that one-party dominance at the local level has actually been very common in the clientelistic, financially centralized cases. And the exceptions actually look quite a bit like the exceptions in Japan. Local opposition success in these cases has tended to occur either one, after changes that first occur at the national level and then are trickling down to the local. Alternatively, they occur in regions that are less dependent on the central government. So the implication here is, I hate to do this in a Japan talk, where to some extent I should be pointing to some Japanese exceptionalism, but I mean, one of the implications of this is that, in fact, far from being exceptional in this, Japan actually looks very much like these other sorts of cases. Okay, I just want to quickly summarize what I've been talking about, and then I'd like to talk very briefly about the recent Japanese election. Okay, so the key points here, and I've talked about a lot of things, so I just want to make sure that I bring it all home. I mean, the first thing is the importance of quality candidacies in Japan. In national level elections, these really have been very important. And this is all ultimately coming down to, I mean, what's undergirding all of this is the combination of clientelism and fiscal centralization, leading to local opposition failure in Japan. Now, ultimately, the explanation that I'm focusing on for opposition failure at the national level, though, combines these 2 points. Because the opposition holds such few local offices, it's had very few good candidates to run for national ones. I mean, the clear implication becomes, there's this vicious circle in Japan where Parties in Japan can't gain strength at the national level without holding it at the local level, but they can't gain strength at the local level without holding power at the national level. It starts to look really ugly, and if I know there are people in the room who care very deeply about Japan's opposition, and right now they're wondering, am I saying that we're headed for some sort of Dantean party hell in all of this? Maybe. On the other hand, there are three ways the opposition can conceivably get out of this. I was speaking to Mike earlier about the possibility of national level movements, that is, people could leave the LDP again. That's quite possible. The recent history of this sort of thing should give us reason to be a little skeptical of this, because pretty much every case has worked out pretty disastrously. And so there's a bad legacy. But that said, you could imagine conditions where this certainly could occur. Second thing is Linda is actually particularly interested, I know. There is a decentralization movement in Japan. This is possible. That said, I'm a little skeptical about how far the central government is willing to let this go, but this could conceivably and certainly help the opposition if decentralization were to truly and fully occur. Finally, there's also clear sentiment against clientelistic behavior in Japan. As this continues to grow, and in particular this will grow as Japan becomes increasingly urbanized, this would certainly help the opposition. But in the short term, I'm fairly skeptical about all of these things working out for the opposition. Okay, let's talk quickly about the 2005 election. What happened in 2005? If you look at these figures, each of these figures here represents the percentage of the total seats in the House of Representatives, being one red bar by the LDP, yellow bar by the leading opposition party. And so what you see over here on the left is that in 1996, the LDP won nearly a majority of the House of Representatives seats, and the NFP won 31% of the seats. Then in 2000, you see a slight step back for the opposition, but the LDP is roughly holding where it was. And from 2000 and 2003, immediately after the election, people switched, independents and very conservative parties joined up with the LDP. The LDP had a majority immediately. After 1996, fairly quickly, people shifted over to the LDP where it had a majority again. But between 2000 and 2003, we saw a clear shift where the LDP is holding roughly where it had been before, but we see a shift whereby the DPJ increased its share fairly substantially. After 2003, I'd written an article for a popular Japanese magazine about this particular election, in which I said I was a little skeptical about this working out well for the DPJ. But the general idea in Japan at the time was this is clear sign that the DPJ is on the upswing. Now, I certainly did not anticipate what happened in 2005, however. 2005, the LDP had one of its two most successful elections ever, whereby it won about 62% of all of the seats, whereas the DPJ took a major hit and dropped down to 23.5% of all of the seats. Okay, well, is this some sort of sign that the LDP is going to reach some new level of dominance that, it's like Godzilla that nobody will be able to combat, something like that? Well, I don't think so. Essentially, this figure here, very neatly, I realize, explains my general reason for additional skepticism on all of this. Essentially, Japan, as I mentioned earlier, has 300 single-member districts, and we can break them up into 100 rural districts, 100 urban districts, and 100 mixed districts. So, and we can look at each election under the new system, how the LDP and the opposition have been doing in these particular types of single-member districts. So this red bar on the left here, 96, represents the proportion, or actually the number of single-member districts that the LDP won in rural areas in 1996. So what you see here is 75. The LDP won 75 rural single-member districts, 75 out of 100. And what you see over here, again, this on the left, that's 1996. The LDP won 56 in mixed single-member districts. And here, these are out of 100 urban districts, the LDP wins 39 of the urban single-member districts. Flip side is, DPJ is winning 11 of the rural single-member districts. It's winning about 36. This is in the latest election, won 36 in 2003 in the mixed districts. And in the 2003 urban, out of 100 urban districts in 2003, so right here, the DPJ wins 58. So the DPJ is doing really well in the urban areas. The LDP is not doing so well in the urban areas. Well, what happens in 2005? Same figure here, I've just added on 2005. The LDP continues to dominate the rural areas. It took a little step back there because a lot of the rebellion, there had been a number of people who were forced out of the LDP at the time. These were primarily rural politicians. Even still, and there are a large number of these rural politicians, the LDP continued to dominate the rural areas. What was a major jump up, though, was the LDP suddenly absolutely dominating the mixed districts and dominating the urban districts, whereas the DPJ suddenly is getting crushed in those two types of areas. So what can we take from this? Well, ultimately, the big increase in success for the LDP in 2005 was due to its urban success. This was something that just doesn't usually happen for the LDP. If you look at things at sort of a macro level, the LDP only gained about 3 percentage points in terms of its total party PR vote. There wasn't a big shift in the country as a whole. It was just that at the urban areas it did so much better. We can talk during Q&A if you like about this. Key thing, though, is urban areas are really volatile, and they're not going to consistently stay like this. Urban areas also are not the classic clientelist centralized Japan. What's more important, and what got lost in this last election, is that the LDP continued to dominate the rural areas. And this is the classic clientelist centralized part of Japan. The rural areas give the LDP 1/3 of all the seats it needs to win a majority. That is, as long as the LDP is winning that number of seats, as long as it keeps winning 70+ seats in the rural areas, it can do quite poorly in the remainder of the country and still maintain its dominance. So as long as the LDP dominates the rural areas, it's going to be really hard for the opposition to make headway. And it's particularly going to be difficult for the opposition to do so, to make up rural ground under this particular system where I talked about the importance and difficulty of the opposition gaining these types of candidates. All right, that's it.
So there are questions? Back there.
Question about your one argument about the quality candidate, Can you I think of another hypothesis. Can you reject that hypothesis? That is
Yes.
second generation. So second generation matters most, and the second generation candidate often first they experience local official or local politician,
Yep.
and then coming to the national level.
Yep.
So kind of second generation factor is more important than quality or quality or experience based on the local as a local politician.
Right. So the example here is, so what if you're the child of a politician and you inherit their seat? And in fact, in 2000, Prime Minister Obuchi had died right before the election. His 26-year-old daughter inherited his seat and won with 75% of the vote. Yeah, that's the example you're talking about. That's actually included in my analysis. When I break it, disaggregate the quality figure, I include, and the problem is it even drops out of the analysis because it's perfect. All of the people who are inheriting the seat won. They make up a very small number of people, though, in every election. In 2000, it was, I think, 7 people, whereas the former local politicians make up a much larger group. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you inherit the seat, that is one of the greatest forms of quality. But it's only, in terms of numbers, it's a very small number of people. Yeah.
Right here.
You said that people are dissatisfied. Does the opposition party address these complaints? And what are the issues?
It really varies. I mean, and when we say some of the big issues, I mean, for example, well, the economy is not doing terribly well at various points. The DPJ will frequently try and raise those types of issues. In certain cases, say, pension reform was a major issue that, in fact, the LDP was not addressing head-on in, say, 2004. There are a couple issues going on here. One is the DPJ, and I've seen this occur, where the DPJ has made a major address in response to, say, a problem like the weak economy. And the media frequently do not cover this. I mean, that's one problem for the opposition. And there are various very restrictive campaign rules in Japan that make it more difficult to use the media, to get on TV, to use all sorts of newspaper advertising. Substantial limits on this. Now, that said, okay, the DPJ, as I said, is trying to address some of these things. Part of the problem, though, is the DPJ is not always doing a very good job of it. Mike and I were talking earlier about some of what was going on in terms of recent elections in Japan, and there's really the latest 2005 election is really an interesting case of a party doing everything wrong. That was the DPJ. In 2004, the DPJ had a wonderful slogan, at least I thought, where it came up with, in response to the LDPs sort of skirting around the pension reform and ignoring Iraq, which was actually upsetting a number of people in Japan, and also avoiding the general problem of a lot of people were upset about the clientelistic tendencies in Japan. The DPJ slogan in 2004 was, with a big exclamation point, "There are more important issues." 2005 comes around. And the DPJ is stuck with, "We won't give up on Japan." So to some extent, the DPJ is being held off from having its message get completely out there. And to some extent, I would actually argue that's not necessarily so important anyway, because the candidacies are much more important. But on top of all of this, I mean, adding insult to injury, sometimes the DPJ is just really not being very smart about the particular ways in which they're trying to get out their message.
I was actually surprised that in the analysis of 2005 you didn't mention postal reform, which it would seem to be a pretty heavy rural issue, and that the rural voters see that as a much more sort of lifeline.
Right, don't want to give it up.
Whereas the urban voters don't see it as important, or more eager to see it reformed. Did you not find that to be a factor in 2005?
I mean, that in 2005, in the non-rural areas, I'll take the non-rural areas for a second. 2005, the election, except in the rural areas, was never about postal reform. Japanese voters really didn't think about postal reform very much. What they were concerned with was this election is about reform and whether or not we're going to support Koizumi in his efforts to really reform Japan. That's in the rest of the country, and that's one of the biggest reasons why Koizumi, the LDP, did so well in the urban areas. This was a reform election. Now, the rural areas, yes, clearly a number of most people living in these areas were very concerned about what, if you reform the postal system, this is all part of one big effort to just undercut everything that's supporting us. What you see in the rural areas was a very fascinating trend. Incumbents won, period. There were 62 LDP incumbents running in rural areas in that election. Now, they subtly distanced, and actually I take that back, oftentimes not so subtly distanced themselves from Koizumi. They made sure they were still LDP members, but they just said, we're not going to really mess around too much with postal reform. All 62 LDP incumbents won. Absolutely every one. You talked about the postal reformers in a time where the LDP was really pushing against the postal reformers. They didn't do very well in the non-rural areas. But in the rural areas, out of 16 incumbents of the postal reform, 13 won. So essentially the key lesson in the rural areas is, well, if you're an incumbent, you'll keep doing well. And the DPJ, same thing. Almost all of their incumbents won. So if anything, this highlights the importance of strong candidacies, maintaining, having just people that your locality trusts and knows in there.
Will?
I have a very general question, and that is, in any type of analysis that involves what do the voters think, or what do they want, or who they like, who they dislike. First question that comes to mind is always, well, how much can we trust the opinion polls that are providing us with this data? And that's a question not just for analyzing Japan, but sort of across the board. I was wondering if you could address Japan and perhaps compare or contrast it to opinion polls that we're used to over here.
Oh, let's see. I wouldn't dare make a guess as to whether or not we can rely upon Japanese opinion polls more than, say, in the United States. I have no reason to think that we can rely upon them less, but I have certainly never looked at anything systematic that would be able to evaluate the quality of either group. For the most part, I assume that I can trust these surveys, in particular when they go along with some sort of some sort of logic, that there isn't, you're not looking at something that just simply makes no sense. Now, part of this, though, is in particular a lot of the stuff. Now, is what you're talking about here the general arguments here, or are you talking about the sense to which people are upset with the LDP?
Well, both. And what really prompted was your previous answer, where you said, except in rural areas, people were not thinking about postal reform. Well, how do we know what they're thinking? I assume that is what's being reported in newspapers.
Yeah, that's right.
And opinion
That's right.
polls.
Yeah.
And I'm always very skeptical of anything I read in the newspapers. So.
I mean, I understand where you're coming from on that. One thing is, talking to people. When I have spoken with people, I mean, I'm more willing to be less skeptical of human beings that I'm talking to. I mean, people are sitting there saying, "What's postal reform really got to do with anything?" It's really the mark of it's a piece of a larger reform effort. That said, I mean, just to take it all the issues of reliability of numbers and all of this, I feel that we can rely upon the actual vote totals, right? And when you see that the LDP, even in an election like 2005, where it did really well, the LDP won 38% of the PR vote in an election where it was supposed to be enormously popular. Winning only 38% at your peak of your popularity clearly suggests that the LDP is not an especially popular party. And so I feel really comfortable making that statement.